But all of us want this neatly wrapped up bow for Christmas where we can have that perfect day of peace, that perfect day with our family where every gift is appreciated and no one says there's no fights or arguments at the Christmas gathering, and we have this sense of peace. Or to put it another way, we want to have a Hallmark special Christmas. Now, as we are thinking about peace, though, we have that hopeful expectation of a good Christmas. But how many of you have experienced bad Christmases? The Christmas holiday season where you're like, I'm glad this is over. Where you burn the cookies, you forget to turn on the turkey, none of the presents are appreciated. Uncle Jim Bob starts an argument about the last political thing, and two people boycott the family Christmas. We've all had these times where Christmas isn't there. And I want to talk about just the reality of we deal with the scars of sin in the present world. Whenever Adam and Eve were given the right to rule the world, and they rejected that right and instead ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they abdicated the throne. And sin and chaos has existed ever since. We know that Jesus came. We know that Jesus defeated sin and death. But when we look around, it's not just that we see the scars of sin in our current world. We see the scars of war in this present world. How do we talk about peace without bringing up peace's contrast with the fact that we live in a world that is overwhelmed and scarred? The second bullet point points out that in 70 countries, there's an estimated 110 million landmines unexploded in the ground. As Christians, so we talk about peace and the peace of Christ, yet we have to acknowledge that there are people who don't know how to even leave where they're living without a fear of having a limb blown off. Not only are there landmines, but if you live in any country where World War II existed, every single time there's large projects to build, bombs are still being dug up from World War II. We live in a world scarred by war. A war that is maybe to us people in our 30s and 40s not as much of a reality, but there are people here who living here right now who felt the tension and pressure of the draft while they were in high school. The tension and pressure of what is going to go on. There was an estimated 50 to 85 million people that died because of World War II. Whether it be the war or civilians dying as casualties of the bombing or the famine or the fallout. From Vietnam and Korea, we still have an estimated 80,000 personnel still missing in action. So whenever we talk about peace, I really do want us to talk about it in a very honest, straightforward way. Because we aren't talking about peace in a way that can gloss over everything like snow falling on a backyard. The snow, whenever you have outdoor dogs, it covers the poop, but does it get rid of it? Okay. And I say that because when we talk about peace, we have to acknowledge that there are times when we talk about peace in a way that is simply trying to whitewash over the problems without acknowledging the actual pain and difficulty. Last Saturday was Pearl Harbor Day. That's a day that for some of us we read in a textbook. But Pearl Harbor Day completely changed the route of hundreds of millions of people's life. Now, I bring up World War II because today I want to talk quickly about a person, a missionary, who dealt with this question of peace. I don't know if I got to reconfigure my clicky. Can we click to the next? For some reason, there we go. So you will see, so World War II, as Americans here on American soil, we had what? So in the 48 states of the continental United States, we had maybe one attack, and it was in the Northwest, and it was like a giant balloon that landed. Today's person that I want to talk about is Steve Metcalf. Now, do you remember me talking about China Inland Missions last year and talking about Hudson Taylor? Now, Hudson Taylor was a missionary who went into China, and he had the vision of having basically every single region get flooded with missionaries. And he's one of the reasons why I actually was so pulled and felt called into ministry. For the longest time, I thought I would be a Bible translator in the hills of China. Steve Metcalf was born in the hills or mountains of China. His dad and mom were working as missionaries in the Lisu area. And while they were there, what happened, like every other missionary during the early 1900s, he was about 11 years old. He was sent off to boarding school. And he remembers while at boarding school there in China, he saw the Japanese ship come into harbor and attack, and just death and explosions. But then he felt kind of safe there in Shefu. But how many of you, in remembering World War II, remember that the Japanese, when they expanded out, China and Korea, they didn't have it at all good. When Japan invaded China, they moved slowly forward, and the boarding school was closed down and evacuated. And then all those students eventually got moved to a prisoner of war camp in Weifang. Now, you don't have to remember the names or the places, but this is actually a diagram of the compound where Steve Metcalf was a prisoner of war. Now, at 17 years old, as a missionary kid, you're expecting to be making these big life changes to move forward, but instead, in his teenage years, he was a prisoner of war where they had almost no good food, where they had almost no availability of clothing, where the water that they had to be pumped from wells, and they had the ever-present watchful eyes of the Japanese soldiers. This little camp, smaller than Astoria, be about a third the size of Astoria. And while he was there, he met my hero, Eric Liddell. Eric Liddell, the Olympic champion, the world record sprinter, the man who gave up his worldwide fame to be a missionary in China. So Eric Liddell met Steve Metcalf while he was there. Steve was an angry teenage boy, angry, not as angry as others because he had found Jesus, but angry at the injustices going around him, angry at the lack of food, angry at everything else. And when Eric Liddell met Steve, he gave him his pair of reins, took him under his wing, and mentored him. And he told him, you cannot hate those that you pray for. Now this is where when we talk about peace, that statement right there from one missionary to a missionary kid in the middle of a prisoner of war camp is something that I want us to think about when we talk about peace. peace at its heart has to come from a love which is bigger than yourself. Eric Liddell eventually died because there was no medical care available, so a lack of nutrition plus an old injury caused him to die, and Steve Metcalf carried his casket out. He was one of the group of pallbearers. And he says that it was at that moment that he picked up the baton that Eric Liddell wanted to hand off. The baton of peace. You see, not too much later, as as American citizens, we hear about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We hear about the atomic bombs being dropped, and we think about the end of a war. Steve Metcalf thinks about the end of his imprisonment. A couple days after the war ended, he left. He left, and him and his parents were reunited in Australia, and he spent a couple of years trying to figure out, what do I do? What do I do? How do I figure out what I should be doing? Getting back into China was incredibly difficult in the 1940s. And in 1947, though, he was attending an evangelistic rally, and he felt the missionary call back into missions. Now think about this. If you felt the call to missions in the 1940s, you would probably not want to go back to the very people that bombed and attacked your boarding school and kept you in prison. But Steve Metcalf said, I'm going to go back and I'm going to be a missionary in Japan. This is why I think about Steve Metcalf and the idea of peace. Are you willing to love the people that have inflicted harm upon you? Now, we are not all the same as Steve Metcalf. There's a difference between a missionary to a group of people and having a one-on-one conversation, but we will get there later. Steve Metcalf realized that one of the driving reasons why Japan invaded China was the same reason behind almost every single war: a lack of spiritual peace. The pursuit of power, the pursuit of gain, the pursuit of an empire is antithetical to the gospel. The gospel does not come with violence, but comes with the Lamb who was slain. Well, Steve Metcalf worked very hard throughout his time he was there. He was a missionary for 30-some years while he was in Japan. Seeing very little fruit, very little fruit, very little fruit. And there was an interesting experience that he dealt with, because as someone who had been imprisoned and a prisoner of war by the Japanese, he would encounter people who were soldiers, who had been part of World War II, who were Japanese, or whose parents had been soldiers. And nobody talked about the war. Nobody did. For decades, nobody talked about the war. Until January 1989, that was a good year, the emperor died and his son took over. You see, the honor-shame culture said if the emperor said we go to war, we go to war. If someone dies in war fighting for their country, you don't say anything bad against them. But whenever the new emperor took the throne, the nation was able to actually deal with the scars of the war. For generations, what was taught about World War II was absolutely nothing of the Japanese involvement. And you had children growing up who then met Chinese or Koreans who were the children of the women who had been abused by Japanese soldiers. And these Japanese children had no idea what was going on. So the late 80s and the early 90s, Steve Metcalf, as a missionary, was bringing forth a dialogue of peace between nations that had extreme animosity. For those of us in our 30s, 40s, and I'd say even 50s, we don't understand just how great the level of tension was between Japan and everyone else. Germany admitted what they did. Japan tried to ingratiate itself into the world by being a super force of economy and economic development and technology, not admitting what they'd done. Steve Metcalf, though, saw that there were people in the 2000s who made it their very job to have these conversations. And he saw healing happen. But do you want to know what one of the most disheartening and heartbreaking realities of the life of Steve Metcalf is? In the 1850s, I believe it was, there was an evangelistic boom in Japan. People saw lives coming to the Lord. The highest estimate now is that 2% of Japan might be Christian. So why do I bring this all up, though? How is this a Merry Christmas, peaceful sermon, bringing up the life of a missionary who dealt with being imprisoned and dealing with conversations with people of incredibly difficult things and seeing very little fruit over the time of his life? How is this a merry little Advent sermon? Again, peace. When we talk about peace, when we think about peace, what is it rooted in? And do we live in the reality that as in the conversation of peace, there is a cosmic battle that is raging? And we are anticipating the moment of full peace. Now, how many of you have read The Hobbit? Got like 3 of us in here. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis saw warfare, and their books were written out of the knowledge of war. Tolkien's intimate knowledge of seeing the carnage of war inspired him to write his novels. How many of you have seen the 90s Hercules movie? Or read the Hercules legend with the legend of Hydra, with one head being cut off and multiple coming forth from it? Well, dragons, next slide. Dragons are a historic picture of the reality of evil in the world. Smaug, yes, it's Smaug according to the British, is this dragon that is the villain of the Hobbit book who has to be killed. He hoards all the wealth. And if you read Revelation, the dragon in Revelation is connected with Rome, which was known for being luxurious and for having plundered the world. Dragons are a picture of wickedness. They're a picture of power. You read about the beast in Daniel and you read about the beast and the dragon in Revelation, we see that there's always been this expectation of large cosmic conflicts. And as Christians, when we talk about peace, we have to tie together the spiritual and the relational aspects. And in fact, the first Christmas was recorded in terms of a dragon trying to do something. Revelation 12, 1 through 5. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant and cried out as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. See, when we talk about Christmas, we have to talk about it from the very not Hallmark Christmassy, Christmas card, Silent Night reality. Jesus was born at a time when Rome said, we are going to get what we want, and you will have peace with us by bowing your knee or having us crush your skull. Herod the Great was known for killing his own children because they were in conflict to him for the throne. So whenever these magi from the east said, take us to this newborn king of the Jews, there truly was a dragon aroused that was going to devour the life of that child with a possibility. As we remember, he went out and he killed all males 2 and under. The peace of Christmas was not because of a peaceful night or a peaceful time. The peace of Christmas is because the God of the universe took on flesh, dwelt among us, and bore the penalty for our sin upon a cross. Peace can only happen because of the Lamb who was slain. So let's look at a few scriptures, though, because what is peace for the believer now as we wrestle with the tension between a world that has war, has scars of war, and we see in our own personal lives conflict and division. So what is biblical peace? So biblical peace at its root, we have in Psalm 23, we have the great shepherd who leads us beside still waters. And his rod and his staff are the comfort. You'll notice that in Psalm 23, using the agrarian imagery, using the imagery of a shepherd with sheep, David, what do we know he had to deal with during his time as a shepherd? Was everything nice and smooth and easy for him? Or did he kind of have to wrestle his sheep from the mouths of lions and bears? So, was there conflict that the sheep in Psalm 23 had to deal with? Yes or no? Yes. Where did their peace come from? Did it come from the absence of conflict or a presence of the knowledge of the shepherd? Psalm 34:14. Read this with me. Turn from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. As David is writing about peace, he notes that there's a direct correlation between separation from evil and pursuit of peace. A lot of us think that peace will just happen, that things will just get better. Have you ever dealt with that? Where you kind of think, well, let's just ignore this and everything will be okay. Peace is an intentional pursuit. You have to intentionally pursue Christ, and you have to intentionally remove wickedness. See, peace is not just the absence of bad, but it's the presence of good. You have to pursue Christ. You have to pursue Him. You have to pursue those who love Him. And then reap that benefit of good. In Isaiah there's this conversation over and over and over about peace. Peace. What is peace for a group of people, for a nation that was dealing with Assyria invading it and taking over? Whenever Isaiah was written, if you read chapters 36 through 38, well, 33 through 38, there's this invasion by a foreign army. Yet peace is a repeated refrain in Isaiah. It's a messianic expectation looking forward to. In Isaiah 53, peace is mentioned. I want everyone to read the references that I don't read out loud because there's just so much. But in Isaiah 53, 5, I'll read verse 4 through 6. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgression, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Biblical peace has always been centered upon sin being dealt with and good being pursued. When we think about peace in a home, when your children are squabbling and you make them make it right, if it doesn't center upon an apology and actual repentance, are the siblings usually at peace? No. If someone doesn't acknowledge their wrong, it's hard for that bridge of reconciliation to be built. So as Christians, we can forgive people knowing that ultimately Jesus is the arbiter of justice. But then we also recognize that that bridge of relationship is always rooted upon a recognition of sin and a rebuilding. Peace is also something that guards our hearts and minds. In Philippians 4 and Colossians 3, peace is something that guards us. So it's the presence of something good that then removes the ability of a Christian to have that internal and maybe external conflict. Have you ever noticed that the days whenever you're not fully dependent upon God, or maybe this is just me talking, I don't mean to project, the days when you're not fully on your knees, trusting upon the Lord and letting him be your strength in everything, are the days when your peace of mind and peace of heart seem to be absent. Those days when you're irritated at the smallest things and the dumbest things. Or is that, again, just me? How is it that the peace of Christ can guard your hearts and minds? You see, peace is the presence of good and the focus upon that. Why is it that people who have experienced more are usually able to say, don't worry about it, to something small? It's because they can see the bigger picture. Peace is a recognition of the bigger picture, and I would argue the recognition of the eternal picture found in Jesus Christ. But friends, this takes effort. You look at the final bullet point. In 2 Corinthians 13:11, it says, finally, brothers and sisters, rejoice. Strive for full restoration. Encourage one another. Be of one mind. Live in peace. And the God of peace will be there with you. 2 Timothy 2:22. Flee evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. Hebrews 12:14. Make every effort to live in peace with everyone and be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. You see what I'm saying? Peace requires effort. And when two people are putting forth the effort of peace with each other, there can be a reconciliation and a flourishing built upon the gospel, that it has the fruit of fellowship that we are called to have. If you want to worship Jesus in the truest sense, you have to have a rich dwelling and abiding in the Holy Spirit. And your love has to be something that is rooted in the glory of God the Father. And if we as a congregation want to be one that shows forth to this community hope, joy, peace, and love, it requires all of us to put forth that effort, to have the individual relationship with the Lord, to have that forgiveness of others, that humility to apologize. If marriages are going to flourish, it needs to have these items. So when we talk about peace as Christians, let us not be like the false prophets in Jeremiah, where it said, people say peace, peace, and there is no peace. You see, because peace is a relative word. Because you can have a feeling of absolute peace and calm during the worst moments of your life if you're rooted and grounded in Jesus. And you can also have a feeling of absolute unrest and lack of peace, even with everything flourishing around you, if you're not lock in step with Jesus. Let us point people to that. Because no matter your bank account, no matter how comfortable your bed, no matter how good of gas mileage your car has, no matter how heat efficient your house is, no matter your coat, your clothes, or anything else, your peace can and will only be found in Christ. So as we look forward to Jesus coming back, making all things new, let us point ourselves, our families, our neighbors, and this community to the God who says that we can have peace through the blood of Jesus. Amen. Let us pray. God, we love you. We thank you for this time. We just give our worship to you and pray that we might honor you in and through all things. I pray for anyone who's not experiencing peace right now, to either have a message from you or to have a conversation with someone charting through what is inhibiting that peace and blocking that peace. May we ever